Welcome again to everyone. My name is Sophie Hunt. I am Public Programs Manager at Hennepin History Museum, and I'm so glad that you could be here with us today. I also know that there are people planning to attend this program later, so hello to the older adults at Ling Blomsten Center in St. Paul who are planning to watch the recording of this. Wherever you're calling in from, whenever you're watching this, welcome, happy holidays. I hope that you're finding a way to be warm and festive during this time. Alex is wearing a Santa hat, and I've got my winter spice tea. So we're finding ways to bring a little bit of light to this kind of strange holiday season. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Alex Weston, who is Program Associate at Minnesota Historical Society. He works for the James J. Hill House and the Alexander Ramsey House, currently producing digital content for them. And Alex was the one who wrote the Christmas tour for the Hill House. So he knows a lot about holiday traditions in Minnesota and has a lot to share with us today about various traditions, starting as early as November and going into January. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Alex for 'Tis the Season, Holiday Traditions in Minnesota.
All right, thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you, Hennepin History Museum, for having me, and thanks everyone for showing up or for checking this out later. I'm excited to give really a sort of sampler platter, a smorgasbord of just little nuggets of information about all the different holidays. And we are in what's often referred to as the holiday season. And people say happy holidays, not necessarily for any political reason, but because there are a lot of holidays here. Wikipedia lists 29 religious holidays and 14 secular holidays worldwide in December, which is the most of any month. And I'm pretty sure that Wikipedia list is incomplete. There are probably even more if one wanted to be a completist. And most, if not all of these, are celebrated by at least some people in Minnesota. And as someone who's fascinated with the way all sorts of cultural customs change and evolve over time, that led me to being interested in the way holidays have been expressed differently by different groups and the way those traditions and observances and rituals have changed over time. So this is kind of going to be a whirlwind tour of various holiday observances throughout Minnesota's history. I'm not going to be able to hit every holiday. I'm not going to be able to hit anywhere near every way that those holidays are observed, because there are a million different traditions. So if I don't hit your favorite tradition, apologies in advance. I also want to just put a disclaimer that most of these traditions I'm sharing are not my cultural traditions. I've done my best to read up on these things, but since this is an overview, it's going to be getting into all sorts of things that are from traditions outside of my own culture. And so I don't claim to be the all-knowing expert on any of these, and any mistakes I make, I take responsibility for and welcome any feedback anyone has to give. I also welcome questions. I believe Sophie will be monitoring the chat and will let me know throughout, and I'll try to pause at certain points if you have questions, but I welcome questions throughout this. Now, I want to begin by noting that a lot of the holidays we're going to be talking about, the focus is on Minnesota, but really everything I'm talking about is mostly stuff that's celebrated around the world by different groups of people. And a lot of them, while I may be focusing on, say, the last 150 years, these holiday traditions have often ancient roots. And as we go through these different traditions, you'll see what I mean. They often began as things long ago and have changed and evolved. And some of the same rituals have been given new meaning. For example, ancient pagan pre-Christian holidays from Europe becoming elements of Christian celebrations at Christmas time is a common thing. But one thing that's notable, if you look just around the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, there are more holidays in winter than any other time of year. Winter is a time for holidays. And it's worth taking a moment to just ponder why. And I can sort of think of two reasons. One, there's the winter solstice, December 21st, coming up this Monday, the longest night and shortest day of the year. The days get shorter as we approach that date. The days start getting longer as we leave that date. That and the summer solstice were observed in some form by nearly every culture around the world. it was a significant date, especially for ancient people. Obviously, if your livelihood depends on the day, the fact that the days get shorter and then start getting longer seems like it's got to be some significance. And so every culture has some sort of solstice observance, and that's the origin of a lot of these traditions. The other factor is, in temperate zones, this was winter, meaning your crops aren't growing. The land is covered in snow. It's a time in agriculturally based societies, which most societies were until pretty recently, that there's less work to do. So you might as well have some big celebrations. And in fact, some of the holidays that are celebrated as a single day today were sort of weeks-long festivals back in, say, the Middle Ages, because what else are you going to do? Now, most of the traditions I'll be talking about were brought here by different ethnic groups as they immigrated to what we now call Minnesota. But of course, there were people here before. So I want to start by talking about some of the winter traditions held by the two most prominent indigenous groups to this area, the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Now, from what I can tell, doing researching and in discussions with a few people I know who are from these communities, again, not setting myself up as the expert on this, there aren't really the equivalent of holidays in the Western sense, as in a calendar date where there's a specific festival, but there are certainly activities that were associated specifically with this time of year. And the Dakota and Ojibwe are two separate cultural groups with their own cultures and histories. But when it comes to their winter traditions, there's a lot of overlap. So that's why I'm kind of covering these together, because most of these winter traditions were celebrated by both groups, though probably in slightly differing ways. So the first is winter stories. Now, it's not just the fact that it's wintertime and that's a good time to tell stories. It's that in both Dakota and Ojibwe culture, there is a whole body of traditional lore that was traditionally only allowed to be told once there's snow on the ground. So here in 2020, it's 40 degrees in St. Paul, so I guess you can't tell those stories yet. But this was a thing where there were certain stories that were especially held for this time of year. In the Ojibwe culture, many of them concerned animals, and part of that was out of the belief that if it's about animals that may be hibernating, it's best to wait until they are hibernating, lest those animals get offended by telling the stories. But these stories were more than entertainment. Traditionally, the Dakota and Ojibwe societies were oral cultures. They did not have a written language, but great importance was put on telling history and passing on knowledge through oral storytelling. And people with storytelling ability were highly valued in the community and still are today. And so this was more about not just about sort of passing the time in the winter, but was an actual central part of how various elements of their culture was passed on. And that's something that was saved for the winter time. It is also a time for various winter games. What you can see on the right there, those are carved sticks that are meant to represent snakes. And one of the most popular games during this time of year that, again, has to wait till there's snow is called Snow Snake. And Snow Snake, they would dig a trench through the snow, and then people would compete sliding the stick and see who could slide it the farthest. And that's one thing to describe, but I can actually show you a little video, which is probably clearer. So these are some 8th grade students in Wisconsin who are playing Snow Snake game, which still remains popular. So you can see there, it's they've got this smooth trench, and the farthest you can throw it, you win. And looks like a lot of fun to me. So that's one game. The other is the game commonly known as Lacrosse. Now, this is a game played by various groups across North America for hundreds of years. It involves a ball and hooped sticks and 2 teams, and it is played throughout the year. But in the winter, a special form of lacrosse can be played, and that is lacrosse on the ice. So Lacrosse on the ice is a whole different animal than playing lacrosse just on a field in the summertime. And it was highly valued for that. This was one of the traditional times in which differing neighboring tribes would get together and have these just massive lacrosse tournaments. Now, lacrosse is the name that the French Jesuits gave to this game when they observed it. In Ojibwe, and here's the thing, I'm going to butcher pronunciations of so many words as we go through this. I do not speak Ojibwe, I do not speak Dakota, I do not speak many of the languages I'll be addressing, so apologies in advance for all of my bad pronunciations. You can see it written there, though. It's something like baga adodoin in Ojibwe, meaning to strike something repeatedly. It's called takapisi kapi in Dakota, meaning to make a ball bounce or jump. Other groups around North America had their names for it as well. Again, apologies, because I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that anywhere near correct. So these were annual observances in Dakota and Ojibwe culture well before anyone from Europe or anywhere else arrived, and they continue to be thriving parts of these communities today. Now, having set that scene, these are sort of generally wintertime things dependent more on the presence of snow or ice than any particular calendar date. The next holidays, I'm going to basically proceed through the calendar from Thanksgiving to New Year's Day. So with that being said, we will start with Thanksgiving. Any questions so far? I'll just keep plowing ahead, but feel free to let me know if you have questions. So Thanksgiving is a holiday that, like most holidays, has kind of its own mythology. And many of you were probably taught a version of the quote unquote story of Thanksgiving that probably fits well with this painting that you're looking at there. That painting was painted in 1914. It's titled The First Thanksgiving. And that story involves the Pilgrims, a group of Puritans who settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, sailing over on the Mayflower. They had a rough year. They were able to not all die because the local Wampanoag Indians helped them feed, and they had in 1621 a big harvest festival, eating together with the Wampanoag and celebrated, and that was the first Thanksgiving. And since then, we celebrate in November, giving thanks and holding a huge feast and eating all sorts of foods that are peculiar to North America, such as turkey and pumpkin pie. So that's the story. Now, like all stories, the reality is a little more complex. And it starts with the fact that this particular story doesn't really come around until the late 19th century. Now, there was a feast held in 1621, but it wasn't really seen by anyone as the first anything until several centuries later. Now, to really get into the history of Thanksgiving, you have to talk about Thanksgivings. This was not a singular holiday or an annually recurring holiday, but it was a pretty common feature in English society going back to the Middle Ages and really taking off during the Reformation, that civic and church authorities would periodically set aside a day and say, we're going to have a day of Thanksgiving to give thanks to God, to Providence, for all that we've given. And the Puritans, a group that was trying to purify the Christian church, they believed the Church of England was corrupted with idolatrous practices in their eyes. They generally observed days of Thanksgiving by fasting, not feasting. So kind of the opposite of what we actually think of. But the authorities in Plymouth and elsewhere declared days of Thanksgiving all the time. There wasn't necessarily one Thanksgiving. In fact, if you look throughout the colonial period, there's a bazillion Thanksgivings. It's just a thing that you would do every now and then. It wasn't seen as a recurring holiday. Now, in the early US, Congress declared Thanksgiving on a number of occasions, again, always as a one-off deal, not as an ongoing holiday. But Thanksgivings were declared in 1777, 1782, 1789, 1795, 1812, 1813, 1814, 1817, and 1830. And the common thread through all of those and through a lot of the colonial Thanksgivings is they occurred in moments in which the nation was particularly divided. And these were often sort of moves done, and I'm not trying to question their sincerity, but they were also motivated in part by political authorities trying to unify a divided public. Most of those dates were in the midst of wars, either the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. The others were in the midst of very divisive political crises that happened in early America. And it was sort of a standard move of early American politicians to, in the midst of division, say, look, we may be divided on whatever the issue is, but let's all have a day of Thanksgiving and come together. And again, aside from closing the stores, there wasn't really any particular way these Thanksgivings were celebrated. Probably, you know, people would observe it in contemplation, in prayer, in whatever their personal mode of expressing thanks was. Now, when you really start to get into the modern Thanksgiving, it's in the mid-19th century. And it's largely comes about because of a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. And she was a woman's activist in an incredibly Victorian 19th century way. She tirelessly campaigned throughout her life for expanding the role of women in society, but in roles that were completely in line with Victorian gender ideas. So she did not want women to vote. She did not want them to own businesses, but she wanted them to be recognized as moral pillars of the community. And she was also very much into national myth making. She wanted to help bind the country together by having a shared vision of the past. And she thought a shared annual Thanksgiving would be a way to do that. Now, the country was not particularly bound together. It was coming apart at the seams over the issue of slavery. And it was in 1863, November 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, that Abraham Lincoln heeded Sarah Josepha Hale's suggestion and declared a national day of Thanksgiving. So again, this Thanksgiving Day is a sort of political move declared in the midst of unprecedented division. And it was an attempt to sort of bring people together. It was also an attempt to sort of raise morale, because at this point, the North and the South, from their perspective, are both losing this war. It's going pretty terribly for both sides, but neither side really, as of November 1863, can say, we look like we have victory in the bag. It has been going on for 3 years now, and it has been brutal. And he was trying to say, even in the midst of this incredibly hard time, there are still some things to be thankful for. And he was hoping that would raise morale of the troops, raise morale on the home front, and hopefully be a conciliatory gesture. Now, Northern writers took Lincoln's Thanksgiving, which was again a one-off. It was just supposed to be in 1863, but they took it and ran with it. And Lincoln, in his proclamation of Thanksgiving, didn't mention anything about pilgrims or about 1621 or about feasts. Neither did Sarah Josepha Hale in any of her writings. But it was after this date in 1863 that Northern writers start trying to craft a sort of new national narrative. And part of it was because if you look at early American history textbooks and early American stories and popular culture about the founding of America, there's one thing that they look to as this is the moment America was founded. And it was Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in 1607. And John Smith and Pocahontas was one of the most popular sort of legends and myths that grew up around that history. But the problem for Northern writers in the Civil War and Reformation, Reconstruction era is Jamestown's in Virginia. And Virginia had just fought on the side of the 11 states that did not want to be part of the United States anymore. So they were looking for what's a sort of origin story of America that does not involve Virginia. And they had to look around for a bit because a lot of the founding fathers were Virginians: George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. Virginia had been so central to America's myth of itself. Well, there's this group in New England that shows up in 1620, and they fit the bill for everything that seemed properly Victorian that they wanted to celebrate. And this feast that is mentioned in the writings of some of the settlers in Plymouth seemed to be just sort of the perfect day to focus as the first Thanksgiving in a time where by the late 19th century, Victorian Americans are way more into having feasts than having solemn fasting days and days of prayer. So if we can find a feast that happened and connect that to Thanksgiving, perfect. And that's exactly what starts happening in essays and short stories and paintings through the 1870s and 1890s. But this is really only happening in the North. Because Lincoln got the ball rolling and because it was a deliberate attempt to recenter our national origin story in New England rather than in Virginia, Southerners were on whole not too pleased with Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving was made a federal holiday in 1885, but was not really celebrated much in the South until the early 1900s, when the custom of having huge intercollegiate football matches on Thanksgiving Day started to slowly bring Thanksgiving into the South. So football on Thanksgiving is a tradition pretty much as old as football itself. It started on the colleges and high schools in New England in the late 19th century and spread from there. And football really helped popularize this holiday finally in the South. And by the early 1900s, both North and South have sort of coalesced around this shared story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag and the first Thanksgiving. And we celebrate in very similar ways with a feast with turkey and pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce and all of that. Now, there was another day that was also celebrated on the same day as Thanksgiving, which following Lincoln's observance, Lincoln set his Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November, and that tended to be where Thanksgiving was after that. That's where Congress set it in 1885. Well, in 1870, in New York City, the mayor of New York declared that Thanksgiving Day would also be Ragamuffin Day, which is where young children would dress up in poor and shabby clothes and would tour the streets demanding food. And this is actually tapping into an ancient tradition that happens at different times of year throughout Western culture. And it's actually a theme we're going to see pop up in several other holidays. There were various times going back to Roman days in Europe where there were different sort of social inversion holidays where the rich would be treated like the poor and the poor would become rich and you were supposed to give to people. And also various days where people would go door to door dressed in different costumes and beg for food and possibly play tricks. And this circus kind of informally in the late 1800s as Ragamuffin Day throughout New England. And there was no set day for Ragamuffin Day. The people of a community would just say, it's Ragamuffin Day next week. And all the kids would dress up and they would put soot on their faces and they would get as dirty as possible and they would wear old, torn, grown-up clothes that was baggy and didn't fit. And they would go door to door and do something kind of like trick-or-treating, including playing tricks often. And this was starting to happen so frequently that in 1870, the mayor of New York said, no, we need one Ragamuffin Day. We can't be having Ragamuffin Days all year. We'll make it the same day as Thanksgiving. And it started in New York, but it spread from there. I did some newspaper searches, and in the early 1900s, there are mentions of Ragamuffin Day parades and Ragamuffin Day sort of trick-or-treating type activities in the papers in Winona, in Red Wing, in Mankato, and in South St. Paul that I could find. So it is something that made its way to Minnesota. And this is before Halloween has really become popular. And Ragamuffin Day would really sort of dwindle in its observances during the 1930s, coinciding with the rise of Halloween and trick-or-treating. But there used to be a very trick-or-treating-like observance that coincided with Thanksgiving. Now, by the 1910s, Christmas has become the big commercial shopping season, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And it had been seen as sort of the unofficial start. It was considered tacky for stores to put up their Christmas stuff before Thanksgiving, but right after Thanksgiving, that's time to go shop. This was encouraged by things like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which began in 1924. They very explicitly laid out in the parade, beginning with a giant turkey float and Thanksgiving material. And at the end of the parade is Santa Claus to indicate that Thanksgiving has come and now Christmas has begun. And for them, of course, this isn't just about holiday cheer, it's about our main money-making season has begun. Which leads to, during the Great Depression, in 1939, it was a very unusual calendar year in that year, November had 5 Thursdays. Usually there's only 4. And so the owner of Macy's called up President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because at that time the president had the powers to set holidays, as enacted in the original Holiday Act of 1885. And usually Thanksgiving is the last Thursday in November, but the owner of Macy's said, look, there's 5 Thanksgiving here. Why don't we make it the 4th Thursday in Thanksgiving, or in November, instead of the last one? So that means we get an extra week of Christmas shopping, but we're not really changing anything because it's usually the 4th Thursday. No problem, right? So FDR declares in 1939 that Thanksgiving is the 4th Thursday in November, but because it wasn't the last Thursday in November, this was controversial. And I think it was controversial mainly because President Franklin Roosevelt was controversial. He was well loved by many people, but well hated by a whole another segment of people. And so people who were not on board with the New Deal politics and with FDR lambasted this move of changing Thanksgiving and called it Franksgiving. And across the year, there were wars of who's going to celebrate Thanksgiving, who's going to celebrate Franksgiving. Basically, Democrats celebrated Thanksgiving on one day, Republicans celebrated Thanksgiving on another day. And for several years there, 1939 to 1941, there were 2 Thanksgivings. And then in 1942, Congress stepped in and said, officially, it's the 4th Thursday here going forward. And that bill had bipartisan support, so it can't be Franksgiving anymore. Democrats and Republicans can now agree on the day of Thanksgiving. Now, another holiday that comes next in the calendar year this year is the Hmong New Year. Now, this follows a lunar calendar the way a lot of holidays do around the world. And so the way the lunar calendar lines up with the Gregorian calendar that our society uses changes. So sometimes the Hmong New Year is in mid-November, sometimes it's early December. This year it started November 27th. But the Hmong were an ethnic and cultural group from Southeast Asia. Centuries ago, they were in what's now southern China and had been sort of largely booted out by the Han Chinese and had migrated down into the peninsula that today includes nations such as Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. They were sort of caught in the middle of all the political turmoil and wars going on in the mid-20th century. And Hmong fighters were specifically enlisted by the CIA to fight a secret war in Cambodia during the Vietnam War. Now, because of the ongoing war and the disruption it caused to farming and traditional way of life and just the general bloodshed, as well as the fact that many were now needing to be political refugees because they participated in the CIA's secret war, in the 1960s, Hmong start immigrating to the United States. And over the next few decades, peaking in the 1970s and early 80s, thousands of Hmong come to the United States, such that now there are more people of Hmong descent in the US than there are in Asia. And the 2 biggest population centers are in Fresno, California, and in the Twin Cities. And those are where the traditional Hmong New Years are celebrated at their peak. In St. Paul, typically every year, there is a giant gathering of Hmong people from across the United States come to celebrate. If you're, depending on whether you live closer to Fresno or closer to St. Paul, you go to one of those 2. And gatherings of between 40 and 80,000 people come every year for this 3-day festival. And for people who still observe the traditional Hmong religion, there are a lot of religious rituals and observances, but it is also just a large cultural day, a day to celebrate Hmong culture. And there's various activities that go on. One is called Pov Pob, and it is a ball tossing game where young ladies line up on one side, young men line up on the other, and they toss this ball back and forth, and it is actually kind of like a courtship ritual. And was traditionally how marriages were picked through the course of this game. Isn't usually anymore, but is still considered a sort of quintessential young people mingling type of game, and is one of the most popular events at the Hmong New Year. There's food, there's all sorts of stuff. If you're ever in St. Paul during the Hmong New Year, it's worth checking out. There's a lot of dancing and cool entertainment happening. This year, because of the pandemic, the first virtual Hmong New Year celebration was held. But hopefully it will be gathering in person once again next year. Now, the next on the calendar, St. Nicholas Day. This is a 3rd century saint from what's now Turkey. And St. Nicholas, who, according to legend, was known for giving to the poor, was popular as a saint throughout both Eastern and Western Christianity. And versions of St. Nicholas's feast day are celebrated around the world. But in the United States, specifically in Minnesota, this day came to have particular significance to German Americans, which in the 19th century became Minnesota's largest ethnic group, were Germans. And the way that St. Nicholas Day was traditionally observed in Germany, and this became sort of a great thing that bonded various people together in Minnesota, because one of the interesting things about immigration, in Germany, people lived in different regions and didn't necessarily think of each other as belonging to the same group. So Germany was only politically unified starting in the 1870s. Before that, there were just various German-speaking lands. And if you were someone from Bavaria, you might not think you have much in common with someone from the Palatine or someone from the Rhineland or someone from Prussia. There are these different regions that each had their own cultural traditions. And yet what happens is when you take people from those differing regions and bring them to Minnesota, suddenly they're all German and they have more in common than they have apart. And so certain shared traditions, such as their St. Nicholas Day traditions, become powerful cultural touch points to immigrant communities in this new land. And so some of the German observations of St. Nicholas Day include on December 5th, the night before, children putting out their shoes and receiving gifts in the morning, if they've been good, in their shoes. There's a traditional treat that's pictured there in the middle called Stutenkurl. And those are little sort of pastry men, and they're holding pipes because St. Nicholas was a bishop, and during the Reformation, they didn't want the saint, which this is supposed to depict, to look like a bishop. So they said, what makes him not a bishop? Smoking a pipe. Bishops don't smoke. So now St. Nicholas smokes a pipe throughout Germany. And St. Nicholas, of course, is also closely associated with the figure of Santa Claus. Santa Claus comes from the Dutch word Sinterklaas for St. Nicholas. And so throughout Europe, sometimes he comes on December 6th, sometimes he comes on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve to give presents. But another thing that is peculiar to the south of Germany and to Central Europe, you might notice on the right there's a strange figure standing beside St. Nicholas, who might look a little like a devil, and that's essentially what he is. His name is Krampus, and he is just one of many terrifying companions of St. Nick that are found throughout different European cultures. Most of these have their roots in pre-Christian traditions, and a lot of them were not necessarily scary or evil originally. In pagan times, a lot of these were figures associated with the winter solstice. In fact, that includes Krampus, who in Norse mythology is the son of Hel, the goddess of the underworld, that's H-E-L, and the grandson of Loki. And he was not an evil figure, nor was Hel. He was simply the god of darkness and of the underworld. Well, when Christians came in, sometimes they adopted pagan traditions and says, okay, this represents Jesus now. And sometimes they said, that thing is actually literally demonic. And that's what happened to Krampus. He became from a sort of revered underworld figure to an actual devil as Christianity swept into Central Europe. but he stuck around. And by the late Middle Ages, he's associated with St. Nicholas's Day for some reason. And basically, he's the ultimate be good or else figure. In parts of southern Germany, if children are not good, they fear that Krampus will come and attack them with his long tongue and perhaps drag them away. He's similar to other figures. There's Belsnickel in southwestern Germany, who is a dirty, raggedy man who would come with a long tongue and with a switch to whip naughty children. There's Knecht Ruprecht in northern Germany, who's a very similar figure. Hans Trapp in Alsace-Lorraine, and Pierre Fouettard in eastern France. That means father flogger. These are all people that come along with St. Nicholas to punish bad children. And these traditions thrived in their local regions in Europe. But when different groups immigrated to America, usually they're observed for about a generation and then they kind of disappeared. These, until pretty recently, Krampus is kind of having a moment, were largely unheard of by the 20th century, but were still around in some of the recent immigrant groups in 19th century Minnesota. Now, I should also mention these figures nearly all have pagan roots that go back millennia. But over time, they have changed and evolved, and that includes the fact that some of their visual depictions as a symbol of evil or as a scary figure, they've come in to take on some pretty problematic aspects in some of the depictions. Sometimes costumes and drawings of Krampus and of Belsnickel and other things took on various racial characteristics. There are sort of anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Black tropes that show up in some of this. The tradition is older than modern concepts of race, but there is some baggage in more recent 19th century incarnations of these things. But those are just a handful. I could do hours of presentation on just the terrifying companions of Saint Nick. There are various ones all around Europe. Questions so far? I know I've been talking a bunch.
No questions.
Okay, well, and we'll have time for questions at the end too. But
okay.
Yeah. Now, next on the calendar this year was Hanukkah, which tonight is the last night of Hanukkah this year, I believe, and it started on the 10th. Now, I say this year because, again, this follows the Jewish calendar, which does not line up quite with the Gregorian calendar that we generally use in the United States. And so it's usually sometime in December, but it does start a different time every year. On the Hebrew calendar, it starts on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which generally occurs from late November to late December. Now, it is also known as the Festival of Lights, and it commemorates the rededication of the second temple in Jerusalem. The first one was destroyed by the Babylonians and Assyrians, and the Jewish people scattered. And after finally defeating some of the later emperors, this commemorates a miracle during the Maccabean revolt, in which the Jewish people were retaking their homeland, in which the oil in the temple did not run out for 8 days during this war. And then the temple was rededicated. Now, this is one of many, many Jewish holidays. There are Jewish holidays throughout the year. The Jewish calendar is full of traditional festival dates. And in the early 19th century, when Jewish people first emigrated to Minnesota, the first sort of wave of Jewish immigration mostly came from Germany in the 1850s. Then by the 1880s, you start seeing Russian and Eastern European Jewish people emigrate. And around 1900 is when Minnesota's Jewish population really balloons. And during that whole time period of the sort of first couple waves of Jewish migration, Hanukkah was just one of many holidays. It wasn't one of the most important from a religious standpoint. Today still, the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which occur in the fall, and Passover in the spring are the most important religious observances. Hanukkah was certainly observed along with all these other festivals. But over the course of the 20th century, it would grow in cultural prominence because it does occur during December. And this was a time in which in a country where Jewish people were the minority and were surrounded by ubiquitous Christmas celebrations and other Christmas holidays, celebrating this holiday in a very visible public way became an important way to assert Jewish identity. This holiday is emphatically not the Jewish equivalent of Christmas, but its cultural prominence did occur partly as a response to the ubiquity of Christmas. It was a way of asserting a distinctly Jewish holiday in this time of the season that we collectively refer to as the holidays. And so Hanukkah rose in cultural significance and prominence and continues to be celebrated by many people, even if they are not religiously observant. They are culturally connected to Judaism or Jewish identity. Hanukkah has become a very important date. It's traditionally observed by lighting candles on the menorah. There's one candle called the shamash that is used to light the 8 other candles one day in turn, and then light all of them on the final day. Now, December 13th, we'll notice a lot of these holidays have to do with light. Hanukkah is the festival of light. St. Lucia's Day in Sweden is often known as the holiday of light. Again, that's not an accident. You're hearing echoes of ancient solstice celebrations, and also just in a time when it is literally darker than the rest of the year. It's a good time to celebrate little bits of light and to celebrate the fact that the days are going to get longer soon. Just hold in there a few more weeks. Now, St. Lucia was a 3rd century martyr. She was allegedly a woman who was persecuted for sneaking food to persecuted Romans in the 3rd century, or persecuted Christians in Rome. She allegedly had her eyes gouged out and was thus martyred. But she becomes to take on particular significance in Sweden, starting at about the 1400s, when a legend says there was a great famine throughout the land, and on one of the major Swedish ports, a mysterious ship showed up one night, and a woman clothed in white with light surrounding her and a red sash and long blonde hair stepped off and began delivering food to everyone throughout the country. And she ended the famine and then just as quickly disappeared. And this figure was later identified as St. Lucia, the 3rd century martyr, probably because she's clothed in light, and St. Lucia was already associated with eyes and vision and light. And so St. Lucia kind of became one of the most popular saints in Sweden. And to this day, it is celebrated often in families where the oldest daughter will dress up as the saint. She'll dress up in white with a red sash and with a crown of greenery with candles lit, and she will serve coffee and cake and sometimes what are called Lusakater or Lucia buns. There's a picture of the Lucia bun that's supposed to represent her eyes there, but it is a saffron flavored bun. Also, traditional Swedish Christmas decoration is the Julebukk, or the Yule goat, the Christmas goat made out of wicker. Now, God Yule, that means good Yule. Yule is the term used in Sweden for this holiday. Yule is actually the name of an older pagan holiday, and you might not be surprised to hear that at this point. Central to that holiday was the great horned god, which went by different names in Norse mythology. That's where we get the Julebukk from. That's also why throughout Europe, a lot of demons and devils are depicted with goat feet and horns. The goat was a figure of reverence in a lot of pre-Christian religions. So he was later literally demonized by Christian missionaries trying to convert people away from their old ways. But in Sweden, the positive connotations of the goat have remained around St. Lucia's Day, which is thought to mark the beginning of the Yule season. Now, folklorists have identified in this figure of St. Lucia a figure that is found across Northern Europe known as the Woman in White. And she's an ancient pagan goddess figure that is clothed in light and brings food and is found throughout Northern Europe by different names. But By the 1400s in Sweden, this ancient figure had kind of gotten rolled into the Christian tradition of the feast day of Saint Lucia. And the Swedes were the second largest ethnic group to immigrate to Minnesota in the 19th century. And this remained an important celebration in Swedish communities throughout Minnesota. Now, finally, we'll get to Christmas. Now, as Minnesota is being settled by European Americans in the mid-19th century, Christmas itself, which is celebrated throughout Europe and areas of European cultural influence, Christmas itself was going through something of a transition. And in the 1850s, when Minnesota becomes a territory, it is still kind of caught between two poles. And I've illustrated both of them here. One is a version of Christmas, and both of these have their roots in England specifically. And one is a version of Christmas where Christmas was sort of a combination of Halloween and New Year's and Mardi Gras. It was a time that would last for several weeks, and it was a time of drunkenness and eating as much as possible, and of the normal rules being reversed. In fact, in the Middle Ages in England, towns would appoint a lord of misrule, who was supposed to be this sort of mischievous gesture figure that would command all sorts of pranks, and rich people were supposed to serve poor people, servants were supposed to serve their masters. It was a time when poor people could go door to door and demand things of their wealthier neighbors. All up is down, right is left, all the normal rules were inversed. And while that might seem very subversive, anthropologists have studied holidays like this and shown that these, in a way, helped enforce social norms by providing an exception. So if we're allowed to break the normal rules on one day or at one time a year, it sort of enforces that those rules are normal the rest of the year. And so Christmas was very much that. It was this chaotic and not at all child-friendly holiday. And then the other extreme was from our friends, the Puritans. And they did not like Christmas. In fact, they did not like holidays in general. They considered the idea of setting aside one day as somehow different from the other days to be idolatry. And they were against idolatry. That was their whole thing. So early on in American history in New England, where there was a strong Puritan element, they quite literally tried to cancel Christmas. And that eventually let up. But up until the 19th century, throughout much of New England, and many of the first settlers to come from east to Minnesota were from New England. Minneapolis, for example, was very much founded by Yankee businessmen. And they're coming from these regions where in the mid-19th century, Christmas celebrations were still pretty subdued. Or there were those that still celebrated the old raucous way of Christmas. So there's kind of this struggle for what Christmas is. Is it a subdued, solemn day of religious observance? Is it not much of a thing? Or is it party time? Well, over the course of the century, the Victorians would sort of say no to both of those and create a new domestic, family-focused Christmas. And so a lot of what we think of as age-old Christmas traditions really come about in the 19th century. And this process is happening in Europe and in America. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between that. But it is the Victorians that give us having a big gift-giving session as central to Christmas. It is the Victorians that start to put the focus on children at Christmas. It's the Victorians that start to move away somewhat from drinking as a Christmas essential activity. It is the Victorians that start to celebrate the home and hearth and family as essential. Christmas before the Victorians was much more of a community affair. It was sort of an all-town party in the same way that Mardi Gras just takes over New Orleans. That's what Christmas used to do in American cities, unless they were in Puritan New England. Now, as the Victorians start to develop the Christmas that starts to look more like the holiday we recognize today, they're drawing from different traditions that are being brought by different ethnic groups. And that includes what we now think of as age-old Christmas decorations, plants of trees, holly, and mistletoe. Now, the truth is, in all temperate climates, people have seen something special about those plants that stay green through the winter. seems obvious. And especially in a time when most of the plant life is dead, it's nice to bring some greenery into your house. So evergreens, pine trees, holly, mistletoe, these are winter plants. And that in and of itself is probably why it's associated with this time of year. But they do have deep roots and significance in pre-Christian society. In Celtic society, holly was particularly important. Celtic society saw the whole world, the whole year, as a contest between the oak king, who ruled in the summer months, and the holly king, who ruled in the winter months. And the winter solstice was the height of the holly king's influence, and the summer solstice was the height of the oak king's influence. And the winter solstice would be celebrated with wreaths of holly. And that remained popular long after Christmas took over from the older pagan holidays. Wreaths of holly now were said to represent the crown of thorns that Jesus wore, and the red berries were his blood. So great, it represents Jesus now. But they remain most popular in Ireland and Wales and Scotland, the most heavily Celtic areas of the British Isle, and became more popular in America than Britain as they were brought by chiefly Irish immigrants in the 19th century. Very similar tale with mistletoe. Mistletoe was sacred in ancient Norse celebrations. Mistletoe was part of the story of how Loki tricked his brother Balder and initiated the chain of events that would eventually end the world. It was fundamental to the Norse cosmic myth, but it's a nice winter plant. And it, by the 19th century, became a thing where you could kiss people standing under the mistletoe. And last but not least, we have the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree, again, was another sort of pagan thing. It may have originated as representing the tree that the god Odin was hung on at one point in the North cosmic cycle. It was also sacred to the god Balder, who was killed by Loki using a mistletoe spear. And it was popular throughout Central and Northern Europe. And for the most part, the church tried to stamp it out. But it continued to be popular in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, what's now Germany. And Martin Luther brought it back. When Martin Luther was rebelling against the Catholic Church, he needed allies. And he saw these little towns where people were getting yelled at for having Christmas trees. And Martin Luther said, you know what? Christmas trees are great. I love Christmas trees. And so he helped really popularize the Christmas tree in Protestant circles. But until the 19th century, it remained a mostly German thing. And that picture on the left, that's Queen Victoria of England, her children, and her husband, King of England, Prince Albert. And Albert was from Germany. And he brought a Christmas tree to Buckingham Palace. And once Queen Victoria had one, everyone needed one. So previously in the United States, the Christmas tree had been popular with German American groups, in particular the Pennsylvania Dutch, which are actually German. But after Queen Victoria got one in 1848, now the Christmas tree was here to stay. And so it would be from henceforth and forever. The Victorians, though, bring us the idea of putting presents under the tree, because the Victorians put gift giving and later shopping at the center of the Christmas experience, for better or worse. And the process through which Christmas goes from a holiday to the main thing that retail depends on to stay in business is a process that largely involves the department store, which starts to revolutionize American commerce in the late 19th century. In the middle of downtown, such as downtown Minneapolis, you'd have these huge stores. And in Minneapolis, you had ones like Donaldson's, Dayton's, Powers's, and in St. Paul, you had things like Schooneman's and the Golden Rule. And the idea behind the department store is really a shift in marketing. Instead of a small, cramped store where all of the merchandise was up on shelves, hard to reach, in boxes, in barrels, department stores were these huge spaces where the merchandise was out where you could see it. And this was a first in American society. And it sold well. And the idea behind the department stores, you'd have different departments. So instead of having to go to different stores, everything you could need is somewhere in this one big store. They would take over entire blocks of the city. And they started doing all they could to bring people in, including taking out illustrated newspaper ads. Ads before this were pretty much always just text-based and small and straight to the point. They're really starting to discover marketing, and that big push starts to really come at Christmas. They start having lavish Christmas events, holding Christmas parades. They start inviting Santa Claus to come to the store, and kids can come ask Santa Claus, all different ways of drawing customers in. And one of the most lasting innovations was the show window. The invention of plate glass allowed large windows for the first time. And these department stores were initially built with big, large windows to let in as much light as possible, to make these inviting spaces to come shop in. Most stores before that were pretty small and cramped. But since they had these large windows, a few people in the 1870s and 80s started actually sort of putting up a wall behind them. So you couldn't get light in anymore, but what they do is they'd set up these little setups where they could show off the merchandise to people walking by on the street. Well, there in the 1890s is a theatrical stage manager and a builder of theatrical sets and lighting named L. Frank Baum, who would later go on to write The Wizard of Oz and become one of the most beloved children's book authors in the United States. But at this time, he's a theatrical set designer, and he gets hired by Marshall Fields in Chicago to start doing elaborate set designs for these show windows so that people could not just see the merchandise, but they would see like a whole display. And he starts making mannequins by hand and bringing in electric lights and making these elaborate tableaus. In 1897, he founds a trade magazine called The Show Window, which instructed others on how to do these elaborate displays. And pretty soon, department stores in every city are putting in elaborate show windows throughout the year, but especially at Christmas time. And it was an art form really pioneered by Wizard of Oz author L. Frank Baum. Now, Dayton's Hudson's Corporation had some of the most elaborate Christmas show windows to try to bring people in, and some of the most elaborate Christmas events in Minneapolis. But in 1955, they were behind the next revolution in American retail, which was they built the world's first indoor shopping mall, Southdale, in Edina. And so now Southdale started having to do these big Christmas things. They started having Santa at Southdale. It became the new department store in many ways. Now, interestingly, Dayton Hudson, which created the first mall and later was behind several other malls, they also debuted Target discount store in 1962, in many ways becoming their own competition. And as a result, traffic at department stores was dwindling by the late 1950s. Now, they were trying to stay ahead of the curve. They saw that the suburbs were growing, that people were moving away from downtowns anyway, so that's why they're building shopping malls like Southdale. But they still want to bring people in downtown. So in 1963, they clear out their entire 8th and what was the 9th floor. Now the 10th floor becomes the 9th floor. And they create a massive auditorium. They're not going to sell anything on the 8th floor anymore. It's just going to be this giant show space where they would have these huge Christmas shows. These are some of my fondest childhood memories, attending the Dayton's 8th floor shows. And show windows were in department stores across North America, but Dayton's was the first to have an entire auditorium space and to have walk through Christmas villages, or you could walk through a show of Cinderella, or sometimes later in the 80s, they start partnering with commercial books and movies. They had the Polar Express one year. In 2000, they had Harry Potter. They even invented their own character, Santa Bear, which sold millions of collectible plush bears in the 80s. And you would sometimes have to stand in line for hours to get into these shows. They were so immensely popular. They ran through 2008 was the last new one. And then for 8 years in a row, from 2008 to 2016, it was the same show, A Day in the Life of an Elf. And the 2016 was sadly the last Dayton's 8th floor show. But this was copied in several places in New York and Chicago as well. It really set the new standard for what a lavish Christmas entertainment could be, something to really still bring people into downtown. On the right there is one of the models of the set for Pinocchio, which they did in 1991. Now, Dayton Hudson's Corporation was also one of the shareholders in the new, bigger mall, the Mall of America, that opened in 1992. And so again, they're helping open another reason why people don't need to go to downtown anymore. There's a Dayton's in the Mall of America, but they still want people to come downtown. So Dayton's is behind sponsoring the Holidazzle parade that same year in 1992. Now, holiday parades sponsored by department stores are an old thing. That photo on the left is Donaldson's parade in 1915. But usually the parades were day after Thanksgiving or day of Thanksgiving during the day, announcing the start of the shopping season. Holidazzle is at night. That was the thing that set it apart. All the people marching in it, and in high school, marching band, I was one of them, had to wear a giant battery pack somewhere on them, and they would have electric lights all over. All the floats had lights, and it would happen every single night during Christmas season. So come in the evening and see the Holidazzle parade, trying to drive that downtown traffic. And it's still ongoing today, though this year they are having a virtual Holidazzle parade. So that wraps up the Christmas bits that I'm going to share. Any questions before I hit the last couple holidays?
Lots of comments in the chat about how interesting things are, but no questions at this point.
Okay, well, and again, I'll save a little bit of time at the end to answer questions. Now, the next day after Christmas, so I should mention, Christmas is December 25th. The calendars have been changed a bit over the years, but December 25th used to be the solstice. And we don't actually know when Jesus was born. Christmas is the holiday that observes Jesus's birth, but the biblical texts don't tell us a date or even a time of year. And so when are you going to celebrate this? Well, the solstice was when the most pagan holidays were. So claiming that date was a good way for the early church to sort of start to Christianize Europe. It also made symbolic sense. Jesus in the Bible is referred to the light as the light of the world. And again, it's the day when the day starts getting longer. It's the moment that Christians would reorient their entire calendar around. It's his entry into the world is the beginning of time, of the new era. And so solstice seemed to fit. So they picked December 25th, and then they never moved the date after the solstice got moved. So that's why it's happening now. Now, day after Christmas is one of the newer holidays, and that is the African-American holiday of Kwanzaa. Now, a lot of the holidays we've talked about have their roots in antiquity. This one draws from a lot of ancient roots, but was very consciously created by one person, Dr. Maulana Karenga, in 1966. And he was living in Los Angeles, and right after the Watts riots in 1965, he was reflecting on the fact that he felt African Americans had no holiday of their own and were disconnected from their historical roots. And the sad fact is that the institution of slavery brought a lot of people here from Africa who then were severed from their cultural roots. And so across Africa, there are thousands of ethnic groups, each with their own distinct holidays and cultural celebrations. But for many African Americans, they didn't feel a connection to any of that. And so Dr. Karenga felt that there needed to be a specifically African American holiday that could draw on the Pan-African experience and be something that would tap into ancient African harvest festival traditions from across the continent, but would be something that specifically African Americans could take part in. He initially envisioned it as a sort of alternative to Christmas because he felt that that was not a tradition that was indigenous to Africa, and they're not one that he was interested in. He later would revise that and say that the two holidays are perfectly compatible. But it began to slowly take off starting in the 1960s and has become a very popular holiday in its own right. Again, the word itself is Swahili, but he drew traditions from harvest festivals throughout Africa. And he came up with the central sort of decoration is this candelabra, and each candle represents a different one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, which are umoja, unity, kujichagulia, self-determination, ujima, collective work, ujamaa, cooperative economics, nia, purpose, kumba, creativity, and imani, faith. Now, this is a fairly recent holiday, so we can track its evolution from the 1960s to today, but it is doing what every single holiday has done, which is consolidate different cultural elements in a way that has specific meaning to a particular cultural group. And so it's exciting to see that holidays continue to be born anew. Now, between Christmas and Epiphany, January 6th, as it is known in the church calendar, in ancient pagan Europe, this was seen as a time when the veil between this world and the spirit world or the underworld was at its thinnest. It was a time when spirits would come from the other side and make all kinds of mischief. And some of these ancient rituals continue to survive even today. And one of the best examples, this occurs at any point between Christmas and New Year's, but that is the Norwegian tradition of Julebukking. Now, again, that relates to the Yule goat, the Julebuk, but it is something, this is going to sound a little familiar, it's where kids dress up in scary costumes and go door to door demanding treats and playing tricks on people. It's basically Norwegian trick or treat, but it was associated with this time of year, and it was very popular in many communities in Minnesota up until the 1930s. In fact, both of those photos you see there were taken in 1930s in small towns in greater Minnesota that had a large Norwegian American presence. So again, this idea of dressing up and going door to door, playing tricks and begging for food, it shows up again and again and again. Just any excuse to do that, that's a good holiday time. And that brings us to New Year's Eve. Now again, in the Roman calendar, the new year began when the days start getting longer, which makes sense enough, but things have shifted over time. Now New Year's Eve is December 31st. And in the 19th century is when you first start getting big New Year's Eve parties. And it's when you first start seeing the Welsh song of Auld Lang Syne associated with New Year's. It's an old song, but it wasn't a particularly New Year's song until the late 19th century. It just sort of becomes a popular tune to sing at midnight. But the biggest parties start happening in the upscale community of Tuxedo, New York, which was a place where a lot of wealthy sort of had their resort houses and their summer mansions. Well, they started throwing these huge New Year's Eve parties in the 1890s. And by the 1920s, tuxedo style parties had become popular across the United States. And in fact, the particular style of formal evening menswear with tails that would be worn to such a thing started to informally and then officially be known as the tuxedo. And that comes from these New Year's Eve celebrations in Tuxedo, New York. It's also in the late 19th century that you first get the tradition of toasting with champagne to the new year. Toasting is a custom that goes back to ancient Rome, but specifically doing it with champagne, that took off during a sort of vogue for all things French. If it was French, it was classy to Victorian Americans. And so the champagne became the particular drink to toast with in the late 19th century and remains so today. Now, for people not attending these big fancy parties, there was a sort of custom that was still popular with everyday folks. All around the city at midnight, people would open their doors and bang on pots and pans and set off firecrackers and fire pistols and yell and scream and do everything they can to make noise. That was the New Year tradition. It was believed you would have good luck and fortune if you made as much noise as possible on the New Year. I suggest we bring that back, especially this year. Let's see how much noise we can make. Many people would go out with bells and literally ring in the New Year. make as much noise as possible. Again, this is before they had TV and the ball drop. So how are we going to know we're all observing this moment at the same time? Get out and yell and make noise. So that was a fun way that New Year's Eve was observed. Now, New Year's Day in the 19th century was actually just as much of a holiday. But first, I'll mention there's another New Year's Eve, which is the Japanese New Year of Ōmisoka. Now, in Japan, this used to be tied to the traditional lunar calendar, but as Japan switched to the Gregorian calendar, it's now observed on December 31st. And I first became aware of Ōmisoka a number of years ago. I had the honor of doing oral history interviews with a number of World War II veterans who were Japanese American and had served in the Military Intelligence Language Service School at Fort Snelling. And they talked to me about how bonding over Ōmisoka, the Japanese New Year, was a shared bond some of them had during the war. And I'd never heard of this holiday before, but I looked it up. And across Minnesota, there are some Japanese Minnesotan organizations that have Ōmisoka festivals. But one way that it's often celebrated at home is by eating a particular kind of noodle, the soba or toshikoshi udon. Again, sorry on the pronunciations. But traditionally in Shinto and in Japanese Buddhism, the long noodles were associated with crossing over to the next year. It was also a time in Shinto and in Buddhists that a lot of various religious rituals, particularly to honor the ancestors, and in Buddhism, a large bell, a bonsho was rung and struck once for each of the 108 earthly temptations believed to cause human suffering. Now, New Year's Day, in the 19th century, this was considered the day to go calling. And calling didn't mean the phone, it meant actually going to visit someone. And in middle and upper classes, this served the function that things like Facebook and email and Christmas card lists serve today. It was a way to stay in touch with people who aren't necessarily your closest friends or families, but you want to stay friendly with nonetheless. And you might drop off your calling card, the sort of precursor to the modern business card. And if someone sends their card your way, if you've exchanged cards, it's sort of like friend request accepted on Facebook. You're part of the same social network. Well, everyone in your network, you were supposed to stop by and see them on New Year's Day. If you were a man or if you were a woman, you were supposed to sit home and let the men come to you. And so men would go door to door and call on all these various people on New Year's Day, leave their calling card, just chat for a couple minutes, just say hi, and then go by. And so you have lots of accounts from middle and upper class women in the 19th century who left journals or diaries. For example, Anna Ramsey, wife of the first territorial governor, or Mary Hill, wife of railroader James J. Hill. They record each year in their diary, had several dozen visitors, had 100 visitors, had 200 visitors, that sort of thing. It was a big deal. And then last but not least, also on January 1st, in the 19th and early 20th century, in Minnesota's African American communities, Emancipation Day was celebrated this day. Now this recognized the January 1st, 1863 date in which the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And so that is the date that in the Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union, slaves were now officially free, which changed the nature of the war from a war about keeping the Union together to a war explicitly about the future of slavery in America. And in places like St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood or in North Minneapolis, the African communities would host these huge grand emancipation celebrations. And they would fill up music halls and dance halls and have musical reviews, and it would be the biggest holiday of the year in some of these communities. Now, it fades in prominence over the course of the 20th century for a number of reasons, one of which is the rise of Juneteenth, which started as a regional holiday in Texas. Juneteenth, June 19th, celebrates the day, June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Galveston, Texas finally heard that they were free. And that started to gain national prominence over the course of the 20th century and now has pretty much eclipsed Emancipation Day as the day to observe the legal end of slavery, but it nonetheless remains a very important day. And so that is the last holiday that I have brought you, having gone in the what is now considered the season from Thanksgiving to New Year's. Of course, there's many other holidays coming up before and after that, and there's many during that time frame that I missed, but I tried to settle on just a sampler platter of at least some of these. And so whatever holidays you celebrate, I hope that all of you have a very happy holiday season, and I wish you all the best. And right now, I welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was, wow, I learned a lot, and I noticed that other people did too. I think it was such a happy way to spend today, and really educational too. So we do have time for just 2 or 3 questions, and I see a couple already in the chat. So if you have more questions, enter them now, and I'll start by reading the ones that I already see here. First, Alex, back to winter solstice. Do you know if there's anywhere in the world or any specific groups that specifically do celebrate solstice?
Yeah, lots. And here's, I know that a lot of holidays throughout Asia and throughout Europe and Africa, basically all around the world, there are different cultural groups that have holidays that are still explicitly tied to the solstice. They usually have an additional significance depending on what that religion is. And yeah, it's sort of such a broad category. I'm having trouble thinking of specific ones now. The one that most specifically comes to mind for a lot of neo-pagans or Wiccans, people who are resurrecting and reviving pre-Christian European belief systems. The winter solstice and the summer solstice have sort of become the main holidays for those groups as they were in ancient times.
Interesting. Another question is about the different calendars you were talking about. So yeah, can you speak to what you mean by the different calendars? For example, Orthodox Christmas on January 7th as well.
Yeah, so the, every culture has had different ways of keeping track of time. And basically, most of them either use the sun, the stars, or the moon, or some combination thereof. And the Romans had a calendar that was a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar. And that eventually gave way through the Roman Catholic Church to what's called the Gregorian calendar, which was put in place by Pope Gregory at some point in the Middle Ages, I think. And that's where we get the current dating system that is most commonly used in the United States. And because that calendar shifted from the older Roman calendar, which was the Julian calendar, and then I forget the details, but I know that the calendar dates have shifted around, and somewhere along the line, the solstice moved from the 25th to the 21st. And that's specifically the Western calendar. So the Eastern Orthodox Church had its own calendar, and then that's just within the Christian sphere of influence. Outside of that, other cultures had their own calendars, the most common being various lunar calendars. And you see that in a lot of, the Chinese New Year, for example, is based on the lunar calendar. So that usually occurs sometime in early February, but it moves around a bit on our calendar because the moon and the sun, while they kind of sync up, they're just off a little bit enough that these calendars sort of wander about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, that's all I see on the chat for questions. There is some interesting conversation about Wren Day, so I'll just leave that on the chat, and when people leave, you can fill yourself in.
Wren Day.
And a lot of thank yous in the chat for an interesting presentation.
Well, thank all of you for coming out or sitting in and taking time this Saturday to listen to it. I've had a blast sharing this.
I do just want to say once again that we are recording this event and we will post it on YouTube. So for those of you who showed up a little bit late and wanted to catch the beginning about Dakota and Ojibwe winter customs, that'll be up on YouTube in the next week or two, and we will let you know on social media when that's ready. And while you're there, you can check out Alex's other presentation that he did for us in September, which is also on YouTube, called The Golden Era of Fake News, which is about fake news in the 19th century. disturbingly relevant for our times, but really educational, and people who went to it really appreciated it. Watch for news about our building reopening and our new exhibit, Local Heroes. And thank you again so much for coming. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you soon. Happy holidays. Take care.
All right, thank you all.